Hi there, folks. All right, let me set up for just a minute here the transition that we're going through. Remember that we started talking about two different ways of thinking about doing community work. One was organizing, community organizing, and the other was community building, ABCD. Then we stopped for a while and looked at one organization that had made a great impact in the world of community development and how they used those and many other strategies to achieve change in their neighborhood, and that's the DSNI story. Now we're going into the next and last part of the course, which is about what we think of as traditionally community development issues. If you go to a community development organization, or community development corporation, they're usually involving themselves in housing issues, issues of economic development, job training, investment issues, sustainable development, relating community issues to things like the food system, the energy system, etc. And then there's the various different ways that faith organizations are involved in this business called community development. So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 4 classes. So today's is housing. And I wanted to set up housing a little bit. I'll be back with another one of these short videos later in the lesson. But I wanted to set up housing. Normally what I would do if this were an in-person class would be to ask people what they were the most interested in about housing, and then I would sort of set up a riff of organizing those things into some useful information about policy issues related to the things they were interested in. Since we're doing it the other way around here online, I'm going to do several small riffs and then send you to websites to follow up on them, and hope that they grab your attention in some way. And then when we meet online, the housing group will introduce us to what they discovered about housing issues as they are related to the particular community of Edgewater. So that's where we're going. That's my intro. Now, here come the riffs. Housing. It's an extremely complex and detailed area of community development. We have an entire course being taught at the same time as this one, taught by an attorney who's been doing housing law for a not-for-profit organization for her whole career. She's retired now. That's a commercial for Erica Pascal's Current Issues in Housing class, which is for second-year folks. Folks who learn about housing, know about housing, can structure housing deals. They can advocate on housing issues. All have to know at least one of the secret languages that comes from policy and programs related to housing. It's a major area of activity. So I'm going to try to set up a few housing frameworks for you and explain a few things. There's lots of things we won't talk about because this is an intro class. For example, the history of housing segregation could be all its own class. So instead, these are just to sort of perk your interest in housing issues and communities' relationship to housing. So I start with 3 things. Because you can't, no matter what, which direction you go in housing, you have to remember these 3 things. They're just where you have to start. First of all, the rule of housing, the rule of real estate. Housing is only worth what the market will pay. It has no inherent value besides the value of the bricks and mortar to make the house. A bungalow in the community of West Ridge, just west of Rogers Park, might be worth $500,000. Well, the same bungalow in a community of, say, Englewood would sell for about $90,000, maybe less now, or you could pick it up in a foreclosure sale. This, of course, is the reason that neighborhood change is such a hot button issue. As neighborhoods increase in value or gentrify, then that's a good thing for housing value and therefore for tax bases of municipalities, but it's a bad thing for the people who can no longer afford to live there. As neighborhoods disintegrate and become disinvested, as has happened in many communities, especially since the housing crash of 2008 and the foreclosure crisis, housing becomes almost negative in value, and houses become abandoned. People are underwater on their mortgages. Banks repossess the housing and sell it as cheap as they possibly can, or they can't sell it and it gets boarded up and then it ultimately gets torn down. Bigger issues than the worth of the house itself. The issue of land has come up in our class, which is also related to this. Land that houses are on, otherwise known as places, determine the value, what the market will pay for houses. So the primary rule of real estate, as you've probably heard a million times, is location, location, location. Wherever you are, that location is either more valuable or less valuable than others. And that's the immutable rule of real estate that can only be manipulated by the use of land trusts, and we saw that at DSNI. And at the end of this lesson, I will connect you to another land trust that is doing some amazing work through a video. Now, the second rule here is that vast segments of the economy depend on building and funding of housing. Think about it. The entire economy crashed because of mortgages that were toxic and were bundled together and sold as investments that were oversold in terms of their value, and the global economy crashed when that bubble burst. And when that happened, people stopped building and buying houses, and the economy got worse, and people lost jobs. When we talk about the unemployment crisis that followed the housing crisis, it was started by and continued as a crisis for people who worked in construction, and then people who worked creating the raw materials that were used in housing, and then all the way up to mortgage bankers and brokerages that shut down, and the credit market froze. Housing was the key element of the economic crisis that we just saw go by. So when you talk about trying to work within the housing economy, you're talking about an economy that is gigantic. It's much bigger than just a neighborhood. The third sort of key thing to keep in mind is that housing subsidy, which is often the hobby horse of lots of conservatives. Oh, people get their housing subsidized. We shouldn't have subsidized housing in this country, etc., etc., etc. Well, that's a myth. Because yes, there is a small amount of the budget, an ever-shrinking amount of the budget on the federal level and on the state and local level used to subsidize housing. But the single largest subsidy for housing in the United States is something called the mortgage deduction. The mortgage deduction, for those of you who don't own a house, allows you to take as much money off your taxes as you have paid for the interest on your mortgage. So your mortgage interest is completely, dollar for dollar, deducted from your taxes, which means people who own houses get a tax cut, and that's a subsidy. The mortgage interest deduction almost demands that new housing be built, which contributes to the thing we call suburban sprawl, and we'll talk more about that when we get to sustainability. Because new housing, more expensive housing, larger housing has to be built in order to trade up for a bigger tax benefit. When you sell your house, if you buy another house right away, you don't have to pay any taxes on any profit you make, as long as you buy another house right away. And then you can start deducting the mortgage interest again, which of course will be higher because you have a new mortgage. So it's a subsidy of homeowners that drives the whole housing industry. It does. It creates new housing, and it creates demand for new housing. So that's the third important thing to remember about housing policy as we go forward. Okay, so right now we have I'd say 2.5 distinct housing crises in the region that Chicago is part of, and this is probably true in to some extent or another in all the rest of the country, because of the universality of the housing crisis. The first one is the loss of affordable housing. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, what affordable housing means, how we count what affordable housing is, and what the relationship between income and affordability is. Suffice it to say, here in the Chicago region, we don't have as much housing that's affordable for people who are making working class wages as we need. That's the first crisis. The second one, of course, is the foreclosure crisis, and that's somewhat related to issues of credit, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week when we talk about economic development. And the slow recovery of the housing market after the foreclosure crisis. And then the third one is, where did all those poor people go that once lived in the CHA? I call that a half of a crisis because it's over. They're gone. It's just sort of interesting to wonder where they went. So those are some things to cogitate on while you look at the following material that I am providing for you, and then I'll be back to talk about affordability in just a minute or two. Bye.